The scent of smoke and berries hung thick in the autumn air when Preston Blake first saw her through the pines. Her hands stained purple from crushing wild grapes into preserves. Her face determined as she worked against the fading daylight of late September 1876 in the wilds near Snake River, Wyoming Territory. He had been tracking an elk through the dense forest when he stumbled upon her small cabin nestled in a clearing. And something about the sight of this woman alone, working so intently to prepare for the brutal winter ahead, made him pause behind a massive lodgepole pine instead of continuing on his way. Preston was not a man who often concerned himself with the affairs of others. At 28 years old, he had spent the better part of a decade in these mountains, living off the land with nothing but his rifle, his knife, and the strength of his own 2 hands. His shoulders were broad as an axe handle, his arms thick with muscle from years of hauling pelts and splitting wood, and his dark hair fell past his collar in waves that he tied back with a strip of leather when he worked. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes were the color of creek water in summer, clear and sharp. He was a man built for this harsh land, and he wore its marks proudly in the scars on his hands and the weathered lines around his eyes. But this woman, working alone as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, stirred something in him that he had thought long dead. She was younger than him, perhaps 23 or 24, with honey-colored hair pulled back in a braid that had come loose during her work. Her dress was simple, patched in places, and her boots were worn. But there was a grace to her movements, a stubborn set to her jaw that spoke of determination and strength. She lifted heavy pots without complaint, stirred the boiling preserves with practiced ease, and wiped her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a purple smudge across her forehead that she did not seem to notice. Preston watched as she carried another basket of grapes from a small garden plot behind the cabin, her arms straining with the weight. He should move on. He should return to his own cabin another 5 miles deeper into the wilderness and let this woman tend to her own affairs. But his feet would not carry him away. Instead, he found himself studying the cabin, noting the missing shingles on the roof, the sagging porch rail, the small woodpile that would never last through a Wyoming winter. The woman set down her basket and straightened, pressing one hand to her lower back as she stretched. That was when she saw him. Her hand flew to her chest, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the clearing, stranger and stranger, separated by 50 feet of wild grass and fallen pine needles. "I do not mean you harm," Preston called out, raising both hands slowly so she could see them empty of weapons, though his rifle was slung across his back and his knife hung at his belt. "I was tracking game through these parts." The woman did not relax. Her hand moved to her apron pocket, and Preston suspected she had a pistol hidden there. "Smart woman." "These are my lands," she called back, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "I have the deed filed with the territorial office." "I do not doubt it," Preston said. He took a careful step forward, moving slowly as he would when approaching a wary deer. "I have been in these mountains for many years and have not seen anyone settled this far up the valley. You are new here." "Since spring," she said, her chin lifted, "and I intend to stay." Preston nodded slowly. The sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows across the clearing, and he could see that she still had several baskets of grapes waiting to be processed. The fire beneath her preservation pot was burning low. If she meant to finish before full dark, she would need to work faster, and even then it would be a near thing. "You have a good deal of work left," he observed. "Winter comes early this high up. Another month, maybe 6 weeks, and the snows will start." "I am aware," the woman said coolly. "I do not need a stranger telling me my business." Preston surprised himself by smiling. He liked her spirit. No, I suppose you do not. But you will need more than preserved grapes to make it through until spring. What game have you laid by? Again, not your concern. True enough. Preston glanced toward the western sky, where the sun was now touching the tops of the mountains. But seeing as I have a fresh killed elk about 2 miles back that I cannot possibly use all of before it spoils, and seeing as you clearly have the skill to preserve meat, perhaps we might come to an arrangement that benefits us both. The woman's hand relaxed slightly in her pocket. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him, clearly weighing his words for truth or deception. What kind of arrangement? I bring you the elk. You preserve what meat you need for your winter stores. The rest, you preserve for me, and I will collect it in a few days' time. That way nothing goes to waste and we both benefit. Why would you do that? Her suspicion had not faded entirely. You do not know me. No, Preston agreed. But I know these mountains, and I know what winter here demands. No one should face it unprepared. He paused, then added, My name is Preston Blake. I have a cabin about 5 miles north of here, up near the high meadow. The woman was quiet for a long moment. Preston could see her turning over his offer, looking for the trap, the hidden price. He understood her caution. A woman alone in the wilderness had every reason to be wary of strange men bearing gifts, but finally, she seemed to reach a decision. Hannah Warren, she said, and I will agree to your arrangement, but I will expect you to bring the elk quarters here to my cabin. I will not go wandering into the woods with a stranger, arrangement or no. Fair enough, Preston said. I will go fetch it now. Should take me a few hours there and back. Will you still be awake? Hannah glanced at her waiting baskets of grapes. I will be working until well after dark regardless. If you are coming back, you may as well help me keep this fire fed while I finish the preserves. It was not quite an invitation, but it was close enough. Preston nodded his agreement and turned back into the forest, retracing his steps toward where he had left the elk he had brought down earlier that afternoon. As he walked, he found himself thinking about Hannah Warren, about the stubborn set of her jaw and the purple stains on her hands, about the fact that she was alone in a cabin that was not nearly ready for winter, and about the strange feeling in his chest that had taken root the moment he saw her. The elk was where he had left it, field-dressed and cooling in the shade of a spruce tree. It was a good-sized cow, heavy with the fat it had put on during the summer. Preston worked quickly, butchering it into quarters that he could carry. He took the 2 hindquarters first, each one hefted onto his shoulders using the strength that had been built by years of exactly this kind of work. The weight was considerable, well over 100 pounds for each quarter, but Preston was accustomed to such burdens. By the time he returned to Hannah's clearing, full dark had fallen, and the only light came from the fire beneath her preservation pot, and a lantern hanging from a nail by her cabin door. Hannah was still working, stirring the pot with a long wooden paddle, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. She looked up when she heard him approach, and he saw relief flash across her features before she schooled it back into careful neutrality. That is a good elk, she said, coming over to examine the quarters he lowered to the ground near her work area. You are not lying about having fresh kill. I do not make it a habit to lie, Preston said. He straightened, rolling his shoulders to ease the strain of the heavy load. I will go back for the rest, but it will take me another hour or two. Will you be all right here alone until then? Hannah gave him a look that was equal parts amusement and exasperation. I have been alone here for months, Mr. Blake. I think I can manage another 2 hours. Preston felt his lips twitch into almost a smile. Fair point, Miss Warren. He turned to head back into the darkness, then paused. When I return, I will help you with that fire. You are letting it burn too low for proper preservation. He heard her indignant protest as he disappeared back into the trees, and this time he did smile fully. There was something about sparring with Hannah Warren that made him feel more alive than he had in years. The second trip took longer than he had estimated. The darkness made the forest treacherous, and even with Preston's knowledge of these mountains, he had to pick his way carefully to avoid injury. But finally, he returned to Hannah's clearing with the remaining quarters, plus the hide and the organ meats that she would be able to use. Hannah had finished with her grape preserves and had moved them into the cabin to cool. Now she was hauling water from a well behind the house, and Preston could see the exhaustion in the way her shoulders sagged. She had been working since dawn, he guessed, and would work until well past midnight getting this elk dealt with. "Let me," he said, taking the heavy buckets from her hands before she could protest. "You go start preparing your workspace for the meat. I will bring the water." Hannah looked as though she might argue, but then she simply nodded and headed toward a covered area near the cabin where Preston could see a rough, wooden table. He brought the water, then began feeding the fire as he had promised, building it up to the proper temperature for the work ahead. They worked in silence for a while, falling into an easy rhythm. Hannah was skilled with a knife, he noticed, her cuts clean and precise as she broke down the meat into portions for different preservation methods. Some she set aside for salting, some for smoking, and some for immediate cooking. Preston helped where he could, though he mostly focused on maintaining the fire and moving heavy pots at her direction. "You are good at this," he said eventually, watching her work. "You have done it many times before." Hannah did not look up from her task. "My father was a butcher. He taught me his trade before he died." "I am sorry for your loss," she shrugged, but he could see the tightness around her eyes that spoke of old grief. "It was 2 years ago. I have had time to make my peace with it." "Is that why you are out here, making a new start?" Hannah's hands stilled for just a moment, then resumed their work. "Something like that. After my father died, there was nothing left for me in Philadelphia. No family, no prospects." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Preston heard the loneliness beneath it. "I saw an advertisement for homestead land in Wyoming Territory, and I thought, why not? At least here I would have something that was mine." Preston understood that feeling. He had come to these mountains for similar reasons, fleeing a past that had grown too heavy to bear. "It is hard country," he said quietly. "Harder still for someone alone. I am managing." There was defensiveness in her tone now. "I did not say you were not," Preston replied, "but managing and thriving are two different things. That woodpile of yours will not last a month once the deep cold sets in. Your roof needs repair before the heavy snows come, and you will need more game than one elk if you intend to make it to spring." Hannah set down her knife and turned to face him fully, her eyes flashing in the firelight. "And I suppose you are offering to help with all of that as well, out of the goodness of your heart?" "Yes," Preston said simply. The answer seemed to take the wind out of her anger. She stared at him, clearly trying to understand his motives. "Why?" she asked again, echoing her question from earlier. "You do not know me. I am nothing to you." Preston was quiet for a long moment, asking himself the same question. Why did he care whether this stubborn woman with purple-stained hands made it through the winter? Why had he not simply moved on when he first saw her, leaving her to her own devices as he had left countless others over the years? "I have been alone in these mountains for a long time," he said finally. 8 years now. And in all that time, I have not felt any pull to return to civilization, to seek out company or conversation. I chose this life because I wanted the silence, the solitude." He paused, meeting her eyes. "But then I saw you, working so hard to preserve your food for winter, so determined to make this life work, and something in me recognized something in you. I cannot explain it better than that." Hannah's expression softened slightly. She looked down at her hands, at the bloodstains mixing with the purple from the grapes, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I do not have money to pay you for your help. I did not ask for money." "Then what do you want?" Preston considered the question. What did he want? The answer came to him with surprising clarity. "Company," he said. "Someone to share a meal with now and then, someone to talk to when the silence grows too heavy. Nothing more than that." Hannah studied him for a long moment, and Preston had the sense that she was seeing past his rough exterior, past the mountain man with too long hair and weathered skin, to the lonely man beneath. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said. "You can help me prepare for winter. And in return, you are welcome at my table whenever you wish." They sealed the agreement with a handshake, and Preston felt the calluses on Hannah's palm, the strength in her grip. This was a woman who was not afraid of hard work, and he respected that. Respected her. They worked through the night, processing the elk meat by the light of the fire and Hannah's lantern. As they worked, they talked. Hannah told him about her life in Philadelphia, about growing up in her father's butcher shop, about the loneliness that had driven her west. Preston found himself sharing things he had not spoken of in years, about the war that had taken his younger brother, about the farm in Kansas that had failed, about the weight of expectations that had driven him into the mountains. By the time the sun began to rise over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, they had finished with the elk. Hannah's stores were significantly improved, and Preston had several bundles of preserved meat to take back to his own cabin. But more than that, something had shifted between them. The wariness had faded, replaced by the tentative beginnings of friendship. "Thank you," Hannah said as Preston prepared to head back to his cabin. She looked exhausted, her hair falling loose from its braid and dark circles under her eyes, but there was warmth in her expression that had not been there the night before. "For the elk and for your help." "You are welcome," Preston said. He shouldered his bundles of meat, then paused. "I will come back in a day or two if you are agreeable and help you with that roof." Hannah smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her tired face. "I am agreeable." Preston nodded and headed into the forest, but he found himself looking back over his shoulder at the clearing, at the woman standing in the early morning light, and feeling something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. True to his word, Preston returned 2 days later with his tools and supplies for roof repair. Hannah greeted him with fresh bread and coffee, and they spent the day working on her cabin. Preston was impressed by Hannah's willingness to learn, the way she held the ladder steady for him and handed up shingles and nails without being asked. She asked questions about the work, about how to maintain the repairs through winter, and he could see her filing away every answer for future use. As the days passed, Preston found himself making the 5-mile journey to Hannah's cabin more and more frequently. He told himself it was because she needed help preparing for winter, and that was true. He repaired her roof, reinforced her porch, and showed her how to properly stack wood so it would stay dry through the snows. But if he was honest with himself, the real reason he kept returning was Hannah herself. He had never met anyone quite like her. She was intelligent and quick-witted, with a sharp tongue when provoked but a kind heart beneath her prickly exterior. She worked as hard as any man Preston had ever known, never complaining about the difficulty of her tasks or asking for help with things she could manage herself. But she was also willing to accept help when it was offered, to admit when she did not know something, and Preston found that honesty refreshing. For her part, Hannah seemed to enjoy his company as well. She always had food waiting when he arrived, simple fare but well prepared. and she would invite him to sit and rest before they began the day's work. They would talk over their meals, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future, and Preston found himself looking forward to those conversations as much as he looked forward to seeing her smile. October arrived with a cold snap that reminded them both how little time remained before winter would lock them into their respective corners of the wilderness. Preston had been hunting almost constantly, bringing down deer and elk and even a small black bear that he knew would provide valuable fat for Hannah's cooking. Each time he brought game to her cabin, Hannah would work her preservation magic, transforming the meat into supplies that would last for months. But Preston had begun to notice something troubling. For all the work they had done, for all the game he had brought her, Hannah's stores were still not enough. Not for a full Wyoming winter, not for a woman alone. She needed more, and time was running out. "I am going up into the high country tomorrow," Preston told her one evening as they sat on her newly repaired porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air was cold enough that they could see their breath, and the first dusting of snow already lay on the highest peaks. "There is a valley up there where the elk gather before they migrate down. I can bring back enough meat to fill your stores properly." Hannah turned to look at him, concern in her eyes. "That is dangerous this late in the season, if a storm comes in while you are up there." "I know these mountains," Preston said. "I will be careful. How long will you be gone? A week, maybe 2, depends on the hunting and the weather." Hannah was quiet for a moment, and Preston could see her struggling with something. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will worry." The simple admission made Preston's heart clench. "I will come back," he promised. "You cannot know that." "No," he agreed, "but I will try my damnedest." Hannah smiled slightly at that, and they fell back into comfortable silence, watching the last of the daylight fade from the sky. Preston wanted to reach over and take her hand, wanted to tell her that what he felt for her had grown beyond simple friendship into something deeper, something that both thrilled and terrified him. But he held his tongue. There would be time for such confessions later, after he returned from the high country, after he had ensured that she would survive the winter. The next morning, Preston set out before dawn, his pack loaded with supplies and his rifle cleaned and ready. He had left bundles of firewood stacked by Hannah's door, enough to last until his return, and she had sent him off with enough food for several days, and a look that lingered in his mind as he climbed higher into the mountains. The journey to the high valley took 2 days of hard travel. Preston pushed himself, moving quickly through terrain he knew well, wanting to make the most of whatever time remained before the weather turned. The high country was beautiful in its stark way, all granite peaks and alpine meadows, the air so clear it seemed he could see forever. He found the elk herd on his 3rd day, dozens of them grazing in a sheltered valley, putting on the last of their winter fat. Preston took his time, choosing his targets carefully, going for the older animals that would not survive the winter anyway. He was a good shot, and the elk fell cleanly one after another until he had enough meat to feed Hannah for months. The work of processing all that meat was enormous. Preston worked from dawn to dusk, butchering and preserving, building smoking racks and fires, racing against time and weather. The temperature was dropping steadily, and he could smell snow on the wind. He needed to finish this work and get back down the mountain before the storms came. On his 8th day in the high country, Preston woke to the whisper of snowflakes against his canvas shelter. His heart sank. The snow was starting earlier than he had hoped, but it was not yet heavy. If he worked quickly, if he pushed hard, he could still make it back to Hannah before the real storms hit. He broke camp immediately, loading his pack and several makeshift sleds with as much meat as he could possibly carry. The rest he cached carefully, marking the location so he could return for it later. The journey down the mountain was brutal, the fresh snow making the trails treacherous and the weight of the meat slowing him down. But Preston pushed on, driven by the memory of Hannah's face, of her saying she would worry, of the promise he had made to return. The snow grew heavier as he descended, and by the time he reached the tree line, it was coming down in earnest, thick flakes that limited visibility to just a few yards. Preston knew he should stop, should make camp and wait out the storm, but Hannah's cabin was only a few miles away now, and something drove him forward. He needed to see her, needed to know she was all right, needed to get this meat to her before it was too late. By the time Hannah's clearing came into view, Preston was nearly frozen, his clothes soaked through and ice forming in his beard. But the sight of smoke rising from her chimney and lamplight glowing in her windows gave him the strength to stagger those last few yards. Hannah must have been watching for him because her door flew open before he even reached the porch. "Preston!" she cried, rushing out into the snow without even a shawl around her shoulders. "Oh God, I thought you had perished. I thought," she broke off, taking in his ice-covered state. "Get inside. Now." Preston let her pull him into the cabin, into the blessed warmth of the fire she had built up. His fingers were too numb to work the buckles on his pack, and Hannah had to help him, her hands quick and efficient as she stripped away his wet outer layers and wrapped him in blankets. "You damn fool," she muttered as she worked, but there were tears on her cheeks. "Coming down the mountain in a storm like this, you could have died. You should have waited it out up there." "Could not," Preston managed through chattering teeth. "Had to get back, had to bring you this meat. The meat is not worth your life." Hannah's voice cracked on the last word, and suddenly she was holding him, her arms wrapped tight around him despite the fact that he was still half frozen and wet. "Do you understand that? It is not worth your life." Preston's arms came up to hold her in return, and through the cold and exhaustion he felt the rightness of having her in his embrace. "Had to come back," he said again, softer this time. "I promised you I would." Hannah pulled back just enough to look at him, her face inches from his own. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hair was wild around her shoulders, and Preston thought she had never looked more beautiful. "You stubborn, stubborn man," she whispered. "Hannah," he said, her name rough on his cold, stiffened lips. "I need to tell you something. Not now. Now you need to get warm and dry. No, now." He cupped her face with his still trembling hands. "I nearly died up there. There was a moment when I was coming down the mountain and I realized I might not make it, and all I could think about was you, about how I had not told you how I feel. About how I had wasted all this time being careful and cautious when I should have just been honest. Preston, I am in love with you," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush now that he had started. "I think I have been since the first moment I saw you with purple-stained hands, working so hard to preserve food for a winter you would face alone. And every day since then, every moment I have spent with you, I have fallen deeper. I know it is too soon. I know we have not known each other long, but I am done hiding it. I love you, Hannah Warren, and I had to come back to tell you so." Hannah's hands came up to cover his on her face, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them, radiant and joyful. "You idiot," she said, and then she kissed him. Her lips were warm against his cold ones, and Preston felt the kiss all the way down to his bones, thawing him from the inside out. He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, pouring all his fear and relief and love into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Hannah was still smiling. "I love you too," she said. "I have been so afraid to admit it, even to myself. I came out here to be alone, to build a life that did not depend on anyone else, and then you appeared and turned everything upside down. But Preston, I am so glad you did. I am so glad you came back." They held each other for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the hearth. Preston's shivering gradually subsided as warmth returned to his limbs, and Hannah eventually pulled away long enough to make him hot coffee and stew. He ate while she fussed over him, checking him for frostbite and making sure he was truly recovering from his ordeal. Only after she was satisfied that he was all right did they go back outside to retrieve the meat he had brought. The storm was still raging, but they worked together to bring it all into Hannah's covered work area. It was an enormous amount, more than Preston had ever brought her before, enough to truly fill her stores for the winter. "This is too much," Hannah said, staring at the pile of meat. "This is enough for both of us with some left over." "That was the idea," Preston said. "I thought if you were willing I might spend the winter here with you. I know it is presumptuous. I know we should maybe wait longer, but—" "Yes," Hannah interrupted him. "Yes, of course, yes. I do not want to spend the winter alone now that I have found you." Relief flooded through Preston, followed quickly by joy. "I will need to go back to my cabin and bring my supplies here, and I will need to return to the high country once the weather clears to fetch the rest of the meat I cached up there." "Then we will do it together," Hannah said firmly. "No more of you taking foolish risks alone." Preston laughed and pulled her into his arms again. "Yes, madam." They spent the next 3 days locked in the cabin together while the storm raged outside. It should have been a difficult time, two people still learning each other's ways trapped in close quarters, but instead it was a kind of heaven. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and dreams and fears. They cooked together and read aloud from Hannah's small collection of books. And they kissed, long, slow kisses in front of the fire that made Preston's blood run hot and filled him with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. But Preston was careful to be respectful, to not push for more than Hannah was willing to give. He slept on a pallet by the fire while she took the bed, and he kept his hands and his desires under control no matter how much he wanted to do otherwise. They were not married, and he would not dishonor her, no matter how much he loved her. When the storm finally broke, revealing a world transformed by 2 feet of new snow, Preston made the journey back to his cabin to collect his things. Hannah insisted on coming with him, and he found he liked having her by his side, liked showing her the place where he had lived for so many years alone. She walked through his cabin with interest, examining his sparse furnishings and the pelts he had cured, and the books he had read so many times the pages were falling apart. "This is a lonely place," she said quietly, standing in the center of the single room. "It was," Preston agreed. "But I needed that loneliness for a time. I needed to escape from the world and find myself again." "And have you found yourself?" "I think so. Or maybe I found something better. I found you." They packed up everything Preston wanted to bring to Hannah's cabin, which turned out to be less than he expected. 8 years in the mountains, and it all fit into 2 packs and a few bundles. It was humbling in a way, but also freeing. He was leaving this life of solitude behind, stepping into something new and unknown and infinitely better. Together, they made the journey back to Hannah's cabin. And then, when Hannah insisted she was strong enough, they made the trek up into the high country to retrieve the cached meat. The journey was difficult, especially through the new snow, but Hannah proved to be as tough as Preston had suspected, never complaining despite the cold and the difficulty of the climb. When they finally returned to the cabin with the last of the meat, Hannah's stores were truly full. Her small smokehouse and root cellar were packed with preserved food, enough to feed 2 people comfortably through even the longest winter. Preston felt a deep satisfaction looking at those full shelves, knowing that Hannah would not go hungry, knowing that he had helped provide for her. As October gave way to November, Preston and Hannah settled into a domestic routine that felt both strange and utterly natural. They woke with the sun and worked throughout the day, always finding tasks that needed doing. Preston continued to hunt when the weather allowed, bringing in smaller game like rabbits and grouse to supplement their stores. Hannah baked and cooked and mended, her skilled hands always busy with something. In the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, talking or reading or sometimes just enjoying the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. Preston taught Hannah to play chess using a set he had carved years ago, and she taught him to knit, which he took to with surprising enthusiasm despite his large hands and thick fingers. The first real blizzard of winter hit in mid-November, a screaming fury of wind and snow that lasted for 4 days. Preston and Hannah were forced inside, but they had prepared well, and they wanted for nothing. They played cards and told stories and cooked elaborate meals just for the pleasure of it. And on the second night, as they sat together on the small sofa Hannah had positioned near the hearth, she turned to him with a look in her eyes that made his breath catch. "Preston," she said softly, "I do not want to wait any more." He knew what she meant, had known it was coming by the way she had been looking at him, by the lingering touches and the kisses that had grown more heated with each passing day. "Hannah, we are not married." "I will not." "Then marry me," she interrupted. "We love each other. We are committed to each other. We are already living as man and wife in every way except one. So marry me, Preston Blake. Here now tonight." Preston's heart was pounding. "There is no preacher for hundreds of miles, no way to make it legal." "I do not care about legal. I care about what is in here." She pressed her hand to his chest over his heart. "Marry me in the eyes of God and these mountains. Promise yourself to me and let me promise myself to you. That is all I need." Preston thought about arguing, about insisting they wait until spring when they could travel to Snake River and find a proper preacher. But the truth was, he did not want to wait either. He wanted Hannah with a fierce hunger that kept him awake at night. More than that, he wanted to bind himself to her in every possible way, to make her his and himself hers, to create something permanent and real out of the feelings that had grown between them. "All right," he said. "Yes, I will marry you, Hannah Warren. Right here, right now." They stood facing each other in front of the fire, hands clasped between them. There was no preacher to guide them through vows, so they made up their own, speaking from the heart with a sincerity that made the words as binding as any church ceremony. "I, Preston Blake, take you, Hannah Warren, to be my wife," Preston said, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise to love you and cherish you, to provide for you and protect you for all the days of my life. I promise to be faithful in body and heart, to listen when you speak and to hold you when you cry. I promise to be your partner in all things, to respect your strength even as I offer my own. This I swear before God and these mountains, and may I be struck down if I ever break this vow." Hannah's eyes were shining with tears as she spoke her own vows. "I, Hannah Warren, take you, Preston Blake, to be my husband. I promise to love you and cherish you, to support you and stand by your side for all the days of my life. I promise to be faithful in body and heart, to challenge you when you are wrong and to celebrate you when you are right. I promise to be your partner in all things, to trust your protection even as I maintain my independence. This I swear before God and these mountains, and may I be struck down if I ever break this vow." They sealed their vows with a kiss, and then Preston swept Hannah into his arms and carried her to the bed, her laughter ringing out like music in the small cabin. He laid her down gently, reverently, and she reached up to pull him down beside her. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I love you," he replied. And then there were no more words, only the language of touch and sigh and whispered endearments as they came together as husband and wife. Afterwards, they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, the fire burning low and the wind still howling outside. Preston held Hannah close, marveling at the turn his life had taken. 6 months ago he had been alone in these mountains, content with his solitude. Now he had a wife, a partner, someone to share this life with, and he could not imagine ever going back to the way things had been. "Are you happy?" Hannah asked, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest. "More than I knew it was possible to be," Preston replied honestly. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Do you have any regrets?" "Not a single one." She tilted her head back to look at him, her face serious. "I came to Wyoming to build a new life, and I thought that meant doing everything alone, proving I could survive on my own. But this, what we have, is so much better than anything I imagined." "We are going to have a good life," Preston said. "I promise you that." "I know," Hannah said simply, and settled back against him with a contented sigh. Winter deepened around them, but inside the cabin all was warmth and light. Preston and Hannah fell into the rhythms of married life with surprising ease, learning to navigate each other's moods and habits, building traditions that would last a lifetime. They celebrated Christmas with a feast of wild turkey and preserves, exchanging small handmade gifts. Preston gave Hannah a pair of fur-lined gloves he had spent weeks sewing in secret, and she gave him a new shirt she had made from fabric she had been saving, embroidered with his initials over the heart. January brought the deep cold, temperatures so low that the world seemed to hold its breath. They stayed close to the cabin during these weeks, venturing out only to tend to necessary chores. But Preston did not mind being confined. He could have spent a lifetime in that small cabin with Hannah and counted himself the luckiest man alive. In February, Hannah woke one morning and immediately ran outside to be sick in the snow. Preston followed her, worried, and found her leaning against the cabin wall, her face pale but her eyes bright. "I think I am with child," she said, wonder in her voice. Preston felt as though he had been struck by lightning. A child. His child. Their child. The enormity of it was almost too much to process. "Are you certain?" "No, not entirely. But I am late and I have been feeling strange for weeks now, tired and sick in the mornings." She looked up at him, suddenly uncertain. "Are you pleased? I know we have only been married a few months. I know it is very fast pleased." Preston pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break. "Hannah, I am overjoyed, terrified but overjoyed." She laughed wetly against his chest. "I am terrified too. I do not know the first thing about being a mother. And I know nothing about being a father, but we will learn together." He pulled back to look at her, cupping her face in his hands. "We will figure it out, just like we have figured out everything else." The knowledge that a baby was coming changed things, adding a new dimension of purpose to their days. Preston became even more protective, fussing over Hannah until she threatened to hit him with a frying pan if he did not stop treating her like she was made of glass. But he could not help himself. The thought of anything happening to her or the child she carried made his blood run cold. As winter began to loosen its grip, and the first signs of spring appeared, Preston made plans to take Hannah down to Snake River. They would need supplies for the baby, and more importantly, they would need to find a preacher to make their marriage legal in the eyes of the law. Preston knew that Hannah carried his child and bore his name in their hearts was enough, but he wanted it official. He wanted the whole world to know she was his wife. The journey to Snake River took 4 days, traveling slowly to accommodate Hannah's condition. The town was small, barely more than a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a muddy main street, but to Preston, It felt overwhelmingly crowded after months in the wilderness. Hannah seemed to feel the same, pressing close to his side as they walked through town. They found the preacher at a small church on the edge of town, a kind-faced man named Reverend Thomas, who listened to their story with growing amazement. He agreed to marry them, and the next morning they stood before him in the empty church and repeated the vows they had first spoken in their cabin, this time with a witness and a certificate to make it all legal and binding. Afterwards, they visited the general store where Preston bought everything he thought Hannah and the baby might need. Fabric for baby clothes, yarn for knitting, herbs and tonics the shopkeeper's wife recommended. Hannah protested that he was spending too much, but Preston had money saved from years of selling pelts, and he wanted to spend every cent of it on his wife and coming child. They also visited the territorial office, where Hannah signed over half of her homestead claim to Preston, making them legal partners in the land as well as in life. The clerk who processed the paperwork looked at them with curiosity, this mountain man and his wife who had appeared out of the wilderness, but Preston did not care about the man's opinion. All that mattered was that everything was official now. Everything was secure. They stayed in Snake River for 3 days, long enough to conduct their business and for Hannah to enjoy some of the small luxuries the town offered. Preston bought her dinner at the hotel restaurant, a rare treat, and they spent an evening just walking the streets together, looking in shop windows and enjoying the novelty of being around other people. But by the 4th day, they were both ready to return to their mountain home. The town felt stifling after the open spaces they had grown accustomed to, and they missed the quiet and the privacy of their cabin. They set out early, both eager to get back to the place that had become theirs. Spring arrived in full force while they were traveling, the snow melting rapidly and the first wildflowers pushing up through the mud. By the time they reached their valley, the world was green and alive, full of the promise of new beginnings. Hannah stood in the clearing in front of their cabin, one hand resting on her still flat stomach, and smiled. "We are home," she said simply. Preston came to stand beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Yes, we are." They spent the spring and summer preparing for the baby's arrival. Preston built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving small animals into the headboard. Hannah sewed clothes and blankets, her needle flying as she worked. They argued good-naturedly about names, unable to agree but enjoying the debate nonetheless. As Hannah's belly grew round with their child, Preston found himself watching her constantly, marveling at the changes in her body, at the miracle of life growing inside her. She would catch him staring sometimes and laugh, asking what he was looking at. He would just shake his head, unable to put into words the depth of his feelings. In early September, almost exactly a year after they had first met, Hannah went into labor. Preston had arranged for a midwife from a homestead 20 miles away to come stay with them as Hannah's time grew near. And thank God he had, because he was completely useless during the actual birth. He paced and fretted and held Hannah's hand when she let him, and generally tried to stay out of the way while the midwife worked. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the day and into the night. Preston had faced charging bears and blizzards and all manner of dangers in his years in the mountains, but nothing had ever terrified him as much as listening to Hannah's cries of pain and being unable to help her. He prayed harder than he had ever prayed in his life, promising God anything if Hannah and the baby would just be all right. Finally, as the sun was rising on a new day, Preston heard a different sound, the thin wail of a newborn baby. He rushed into the bedroom to find Hannah propped up on pillows, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. "A son," she said, her voice hoarse but filled with joy. "We have a son, Preston." Preston approached slowly, almost afraid to look, but when Hannah pulled back the blanket to reveal the baby's face, he felt his heart expand in his chest. The baby was tiny and red-faced, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn the same creek watercolor as his father's. He was perfect. "May I hold him?" Preston asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hannah carefully transferred the baby to his arms, and Preston looked down at his son with wonder. This tiny person, half him and half Hannah, a whole new life they had created together. It was the most miraculous thing he had ever experienced. "What should we name him?" Hannah asked. They had discussed many options but never settled on one. But looking at his son now, Preston knew exactly what the boy's name should be. "Thomas," he said, "after my brother who died in the war." "Thomas Blake." Hannah's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, that is perfect." Thomas Blake turned out to be a healthy, hungry baby with powerful lungs. He kept them up at all hours those first few weeks, and Preston and Hannah stumbled through their days in an exhausted haze. But Preston had never been happier. He would wake in the night to feed the fire and hear Hannah nursing the baby, humming softly to him, and feel such contentment that it was almost painful. As Thomas grew, Preston marveled at every change, every milestone. The first time the baby smiled at him, Preston thought his heart might burst. When Thomas learned to roll over, then to sit up, then to crawl, Preston was there to witness it all, encouraged by every achievement. He had not known it was possible to love someone so fiercely, so completely, as he loved his son. The seasons turned again, and they prepared once more for winter. But this time was different. This time they were not two people alone but a family with a child depending on them. Preston hunted with even more dedication, determined to ensure they would want for nothing. He brought down elk and deer, trapped rabbits and grouse, fished in the cold streams. Hannah preserved it all, her hands as skilled as ever despite the added work of caring for Thomas. During the long winter nights, they would sit together by the fire, Thomas sleeping in his cradle nearby, and talk about the future. They spoke of expanding the cabin to add more rooms, of perhaps clearing more land for a larger garden, of the siblings Thomas might one day have. They were building a life here, a real life, and Preston felt a sense of purpose and belonging he had never known before. Spring came again, and with it Preston and Hannah's second wedding anniversary. They celebrated quietly, just the two of them after Thomas had been put to bed, with a special dinner and the bottle of whiskey Preston had been saving. They toasted to 2 years of marriage, to their son, to the life they had built together in this wild place. "I never imagined I could be this happy," Hannah said, her hand in Preston's as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out. "When I came to Wyoming, I was running away from loneliness, from a life that felt empty. But I thought I would always be alone, that I would just learn to be content with it. I never dreamed I would find you." "I was not even looking," Preston admitted. "I had accepted that I would spend my life alone in these mountains. I thought I preferred it that way. But then I saw you preserving food for winter, working so hard, so determined, and everything changed. You changed everything." Hannah turned to kiss him, soft and sweet. "I am glad you found me," she whispered against his lips. "I am glad you hunted extra game so my stores would be full. I am glad you kept coming back. I am glad for all of it." "So am I," Preston said. "So am I." That summer, Hannah discovered she was pregnant again. Thomas was barely a year old, and the news that another baby was on the way was both exciting and daunting. But they welcomed it, knowing that a large family would be a blessing in this isolated place. Their daughter was born the following spring, in April when the world was bursting with new life. The birth was easier than Thomas's had been, and when Preston held his daughter for the first time, he thought his heart might actually explode from the love he felt. "Sarah," Hannah said, naming the baby after her own mother. Sarah Marie Blake. Sarah was different from Thomas from the start. Where he had been fussy and demanding, she was peaceful and content. She had her mother's honey-colored hair and her father's eyes, and Preston adored her instantly. Thomas, newly 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her gently and bring her his toys. The cabin felt full now, full of life and noise and love. Preston built an addition that summer, adding 2 small bedrooms so the children would have their own space as they grew. It was hard work, especially while also hunting and maintaining their supplies, but Preston did not mind. He was building something lasting, something real, a home for his family. As the years passed, Preston and Hannah settled into the rhythms of family life. They had 2 more children, another son they named Daniel and another daughter they named Mary. The cabin grew to accommodate them all, expanding from the small one-room structure. It had been when Preston first saw it to a proper house with multiple rooms and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Preston taught the children everything he knew about surviving in the mountains. He taught Thomas to track and hunt, to read the weather and navigate by the stars. He taught Sarah to set snares and fish in the streams. As Daniel and Mary grew old enough, he taught them too, each child learning the skills they would need to thrive in this harsh but beautiful land. Hannah taught them other things. She taught them to read and write using the books she had brought from Philadelphia, and others they acquired on occasional trips to Snake River. She taught them to cook and preserve food, to sew and mend, to appreciate music and stories, and all the things that made life rich beyond mere survival. The children grew strong and healthy, brown from the sun and tough from the mountain life. They ran wild in the summers, exploring the forests and meadows under their father's watchful eye. In the winters, they stayed close to home, playing games and learning lessons and listening to their parents' stories of how they had met, how they had fallen in love, how they had built this life together. Preston never tired of watching Hannah with their children. She was a wonderful mother, patient but firm, loving but not coddling. She encouraged their independence while keeping them safe, and Preston admired the balance she struck. He tried to follow her example, though he knew he was sometimes too protective, too quick to worry about every potential danger. "They need to learn to face challenges," Hannah would remind him when he fretted. "We will not always be here to protect them. They need to be strong." She was right, as she usually was. So Preston stepped back, let the children take risks and make mistakes and learn from them. It was harder than any work he had ever done, watching his children stumble and skin their knees and sometimes cry from hurt or disappointment. But they did learn, and they did grow strong, and Preston was proud of them beyond measure. The years flowed by like water in a mountain stream, swift and clear. Preston's hair began to show silver at the temples, and Hannah found laugh lines forming at the corners of her eyes. Thomas grew tall and broad-shouldered like his father. Sarah inherited her mother's skill with her hands and her quick mind. Daniel was quiet and thoughtful with a gift for understanding animals, and Mary was fierce and fearless and kept them all on their toes. Sometimes, on quiet evenings after the children had gone to bed, Preston and Hannah would sit together on their porch and marvel at the life they had built. The cabin was weathered now, worn smooth by wind and sun and years of use. The clearing had expanded as they had cut back more trees and planted a larger garden. There were outbuildings now, a barn for the animals they had acquired, a smokehouse, a shed for tools. "You ever regret it?" Preston asked one such evening. "Staying here, living so far from civilization. The children will have to work harder than most for everything they achieve." Hannah took his hand, her fingers still calloused from work but warm and familiar. "Never," she said firmly. "This life is hard, yes, but it is ours. We built it together from nothing. And our children are growing up knowing the value of hard work, knowing how to rely on themselves and each other. They are learning lessons most people never learn. I would not trade that for all the comforts in the world." "I love you," Preston said, as he had said countless times over the years. But it never grew old. Every time he said it, he meant it just as deeply as the first time. "I love you too," Hannah replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for finding me all those years ago. Thank you for hunting extra game so my stores would be full. Thank you for staying." "Where else would I go?" Preston asked, kissing the top of her head. "Everything I need is right here." Thomas left home when he was 19, heading down to Snake River to work at the lumber mill. It broke Preston's heart a little to see him go, but he was proud too. His son was strong and capable, ready to make his own way in the world. Sarah married a homesteader's son when she was 20, and they settled on a claim 15 miles south of Preston and Hannah's cabin. Close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to have their own life. Daniel stayed home longest, helping his father with the hunting and trapping, content with the mountain life in a way his siblings had not been. He was 23 when he finally decided to try his hand at ranching, partnering with a friend to run cattle in the valley below. Mary, the youngest, surprised them all by declaring she wanted to be a teacher. She left for training when she was 18 and returned 2 years later to start a small school in Snake River. Preston and Hannah found themselves alone again in their cabin, their children grown and scattered. It was an adjustment, the quiet after so many years of noise and chaos. But it was not a sad quiet. It was peaceful, comfortable, the silence of two people who knew each other so well that words were often unnecessary. They were in their 50s now, no longer young but not yet old. Preston's hair was more silver than dark, and he moved a bit more carefully than he once had, mindful of old injuries and the wear of hard living. Hannah's hair had faded to a soft gray gold, and she wore spectacles now when she sewed or read. But to Preston, she was just as beautiful as she had been that first day he saw her with purple-stained hands. They settled back into a rhythm much like their early days, just the two of them against the mountains and the seasons. They still worked hard, Preston still hunted and Hannah still preserved, but there was less urgency now, less pressure. They had proven they could survive. Now they could simply live. Grandchildren came first from Thomas, then from Sarah. Preston delighted in these small visitors, teaching them the same lessons he had taught their parents, telling them the same stories. Hannah baked special treats for them and sewed them clothes, and the cabin came alive with laughter whenever they visited. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children surprised them by all coming home at once, bringing their spouses and children for a celebration. The cabin and yard were packed with family, 3 generations gathered together. They roasted an elk over an outdoor fire and told stories late into the night, and Preston looked around at all these people. All this love that had grown from the day he first saw Hannah preserving food for winter and felt overwhelming gratitude. "What are you thinking?" Hannah asked, coming to stand beside him as the party continued around them. "I am thinking about how different my life would be if I had not gone tracking that elk that day," Preston said. "If I had gone a different direction, or if I had simply moved on when I first saw your cabin. I would have missed all of this. I would have lived and died alone in these mountains, and I never would have known what I was missing." "But you did not miss it," Hannah said, slipping her arm around his waist. "You found me, And I found you, and we built this beautiful life together." "The best life," Preston agreed. They stood together watching their family, these people who existed because they had found each other, because Preston had hunted extra game so Hannah's stores would be full, because they had fallen in love in a wild place and made it their home. Preston and Hannah lived in their mountain cabin for many more years, long enough to see their grandchildren grow, and some of them have children of their own. They grew old together, their bodies wearing down but their love as strong as ever. They still sat on their porch every evening weather permitted, still held hands like newlyweds, still looked at each other with the same affection and desire that had marked their early days. When Preston was 72, he fell ill with a fever that refused to break. Hannah nursed him through it, as she had nursed him through illnesses and injuries countless times over the years. He recovered, but they both knew he was slowing down, that his body was finally giving in to the decades of hard mountain living. "I have had a good life," he told Hannah one evening as they sat by the fire, him wrapped in blankets despite the warmth. "Better than I ever deserved." "Do not talk like that," Hannah said, but her eyes were wet. "You deserve every happiness, Preston Blake." "I got it," he assured her. "I got more than happiness. I got you." Preston lived 5 more years after that, years he spent mostly close to home, content to let Daniel handle the hunting while he supervised from the porch. He played with his great-grandchildren when they visited, told them stories of the old days, passed on his knowledge and his memories. And every night, he fell asleep next to Hannah, grateful for one more day in her company. When Preston finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 77, Hannah grieved deeply, but not bitterly. They had had 44 years of marriage, thousands of days and nights together, a lifetime of love and partnership. She missed him terribly, but she did not regret a single moment. Hannah lived another 8 years after Preston's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She stayed in the cabin they had built together, refusing all offers to come live in town or with one of the children. This was her home, the place where she had fallen in love and raised her family and lived the best years of her life. She would not leave it. On a crisp autumn day much like the one when Preston had first found her preserving food for winter, Hannah passed away quietly in her sleep. She was 88 years old, and she died in the bed she had shared with Preston for over 4 decades, in the cabin that held all their memories. Her children buried her next to Preston on a hill overlooking the valley, under the shade of a massive pine tree. They stood together at the graveside, all of them gray-haired now with children and grandchildren of their own, and remembered their parents. They remembered the love that had been the foundation of their family, the example Preston and Hannah had set of what a marriage could be. Thomas, oldest of the children and now 70 years old himself, placed a hand on the rough wooden marker that bore his parents' names. "They had something special," he said to his siblings, "something most people never find." "They found each other," Sarah agreed, tears running down her weathered cheeks. "In the middle of nowhere, against all odds, they found each other. And they loved each other every day," Daniel added. "Through hard times and good, through seasons and years, they never stopped loving each other." "That is the legacy they left us," Mary said, the youngest but no longer young at 65. "Not just this land or this cabin, but the example of what love should be. That is what we need to carry forward." They stood together for a while longer, saying their goodbyes, then slowly made their way back down the hill. The cabin still stood in the clearing below, weathered and worn but solid, a testament to what 2 people could build together when they had love and determination, and each other. The clearing where Preston had first found Hannah preserving food for winter remained in the family, passed down through the generations. Thomas's grandson eventually moved into the old cabin, renovating it carefully while maintaining its character and history. The family never forgot the story of Preston and Hannah, of the mountain man who had hunted extra game so a lonely woman's stores would be full, and of the love that had grown from that simple act of kindness. It became a legend in the family, told and retold with each generation. How Preston had been tracking an elk and found Hannah instead, working so hard to prepare for winter. How he had brought her game and helped her prepare for the cold months ahead. How they had fallen in love in that wild place and built a life together that lasted nearly half a century. How their love had created a family that spread across the Wyoming Territory and beyond, all of them descendants of that chance meeting in a mountain clearing. And on autumn evenings when the air turned crisp and the smell of wood smoke drifted through the valley, when the light slanted golden through the pines just as it had on that day in 1876, you could almost see them there still, Preston and Hannah, working together to preserve food for winter, their hands touching as they worked, their eyes meeting across the fire, falling in love all over again for the 10,000th time. It was a story of survival and strength, of building a life in a hard land. But more than that, it was a love story, pure and true, the kind that happens once in a lifetime if you are very lucky. Preston and Hannah had been that lucky, and they had made the most of every moment they were given. Their legacy lived on not just in their descendants but in the land itself, in the cabin that still stood strong, in the cleared fields and the trails through the forest, in every mark they had left on that wild place they had called home. But most of all, their legacy lived on in the story of their love, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the simplest beginnings, from a mountain man finding a woman preserving food for winter and deciding to hunt extra game so her stores would be full. And if that is not a perfect love story, what is?